David Hartley stood frozen at the Henderson's Market checkout, staring at the glowing red screen that seemed to mock him with its simple message, "Declined." His 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, tugged at his sleeve, her small arms wrapped around the birthday cake mix they'd picked out for her party next week, a party he now realized he couldn't afford. "Try it again, sir," the cashier said mechanically, not looking up from her register as she processed the routine humiliation of poverty. She was young, maybe 19, with tired eyes and purple streaks in her hair that suggested dreams of being somewhere else. David swiped the card again, his hands trembling slightly. The total was $43.87. 3 months ago, that amount would have been pocket change. Now it represented the difference between dignity and desperation. The items in his cart told the story of careful rationing: generic cereal, store-brand milk, the cheapest lunch meat, and that birthday cake mix Sophie had chosen with such excitement. "Declined" flashed again, and the line behind him grew restless. A businessman in an expensive suit checked his phone with an audible sigh, his Italian leather shoes tapping impatiently against the worn linoleum. "Come on, man," someone muttered from the back. "Some of us have places to be." David's face burned with shame as he fumbled for his wallet, knowing it contained only his maxed-out credit card and $18 in cash. Money he'd been saving for Sophie's school lunch account. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, making his discount store polo shirt and fraying khakis look even shabbier. He was acutely aware of how far he'd fallen from the man who used to stride through corporate boardrooms in tailored suits, making decisions that affected million-dollar budgets. "Dad!" Sophie's voice was small, confused. She'd never seen her father unable to buy groceries before. Her brown eyes, so much like her mother's, looked up at him with the kind of trust that made his chest ache. She still believed he could fix anything, solve any problem, make everything okay with dad magic. "Technical problem, sweetheart," David managed, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. The divorce had cleaned out his savings. Michelle's lawyer had been particularly effective at claiming half of everything David had worked 15 years to build. Losing his marketing manager position 6 weeks ago when the company restructured had been the final blow to his carefully constructed middle-class life. The cashier, whose name tag read Brianna, looked at him with something approaching sympathy. She'd probably seen this scene play out dozens of times. Henderson's Market served a neighborhood in transition, where gentrification bumped up against generational poverty, where people like David ended up when their suburban dreams collapsed. "I can pay cash for some items," he said quietly, scanning their modest cart to decide what his daughter could live without. The cake mix was essential. He couldn't disappoint her on her birthday. The milk was necessary. Maybe he could put back the lunch meat and make peanut butter sandwiches for the rest of the week. "Mister?" A small voice beside him made him turn. A little black girl, maybe 7 years old, stood holding a crumpled $10 bill. Her school uniform was clean, but showed signs of wear at the cuffs and collar, carefully maintained but clearly not new. Her hair was braided into neat cornrows with colorful beads that caught the harsh store lighting. Small, scuffed sneakers and a backpack decorated with a unicorn sticker completed the picture of a child whose family knew the value of every dollar. "You can have this money," she said, holding out the bill with the solemn formality of someone making an important decision. The entire line fell silent. The businessman stopped tapping his foot. Brianna looked up from her register for the first time. An elderly woman with a cart full of cat food smiled softly. Even the security guard near the entrance seemed to pause and watch. David knelt to her eye level, his throat tight with emotion. Up close, he could see she had paint under her fingernails, probably from art class, and a small Band-Aid on her chin. She couldn't have been much older than Sophie, yet she radiated a confidence and compassion that humbled him. "That's incredibly kind, but I can't take your money," he said gently. "My grandma says when someone's standing alone, you stand next to them. That's what good people do." She pressed the bill into his palm with the solemn determination of someone much older, her small fingers surprisingly warm and strong. Before David could respond, a young woman appeared, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. She wore medical scrubs with a hospital ID badge, her face showing the exhaustion of someone working too many hours for too little pay. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to caring for others. "Anaya, baby, what are you doing?" the woman asked gently, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that spoke of roots in a place where community meant something. "This daddy needs help buying food for his little girl," Anaya explained matter-of-factly. "His money card is broken." The woman looked at David with kind but assessing eyes, taking in his obvious middle-class background now colliding with immediate need. She'd probably learned to read people quickly in her profession, to distinguish between genuine crisis and manipulation. "I'm Dr. Nicole Johnson. This is my daughter, Anaya. I apologize if she's overstepping." "She's not," David interrupted, standing. "She's being more generous than anyone has a right to expect. I'm David Hartley, and this is Sophie." Sophie had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, her young mind processing a lesson about kindness that would stay with her forever. She stepped forward and offered Anaya a shy smile. "I like your backpack," Sophie said. "I have a unicorn stuffed animal at home." "Really? What's her name?" "Sparkles. She's purple with a silver horn." Anaya grinned, revealing a gap where she'd recently lost a tooth. "That's a perfect unicorn name." The cashier, Brianna, had been watching the exchange with growing emotion. She quietly began bagging David's groceries, her movements gentle and deliberate. "Don't worry about the difference," she murmured, her own struggles reflected in her understanding eyes. "Sometimes the register gets confused." David started to protest, but she shook her head firmly. "I've got a little one at home, too. We all need help sometimes." "Sit." As Brianna handed him the bags, David noticed she'd added a small pack of birthday candles, the kind with numbers on them. His eyes misted as he realized she'd been paying attention, had understood that the cake mix represented something important. Outside in the parking lot, David caught up with Nicole and Anaya. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, and he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. The parking lot told its own stories: beat-up cars next to newer models, shopping carts abandoned by people too tired to return them, the constant hum of traffic on the nearby highway. "Dr. Johnson, I need to thank you both properly. I will pay this back." Nicole studied him for a moment, taking in his expensive shoes, worn thin at the heels, his designer shirt with a small stain on the cuff, the careful way he held himself despite his obvious distress. She'd learned to read the signs of recent financial catastrophe, the way people clung to the trappings of their former life while adapting to harsh new realities. "Call me Nicole. And don't pay it back, pay it forward. That's how community is supposed to work." She paused, seeming to make a decision. "Look, I don't usually do this, but would you and Sophie like to get some ice cream? There's a place around the corner that serves huge portions for reasonable prices." Anaya's been asking to celebrate finishing her math workbook early. David hesitated. Pride warred with loneliness, and with Sophie looking at him hopefully, loneliness won. "We'd like that very much." At Scoops and Dreams, a local ice cream parlor with mismatched furniture and walls covered in children's artwork, David learned more about Nicole and Anaya over shared Sundays. Nicole was completing her residency at City General Hospital, working exhausting hours while raising Anaya alone. Her ex-husband had left when Anaya was 3, claiming he wasn't ready for the responsibility of a family. "Some days I wonder if I'm doing right by her," Nicole confided as they watched their daughters compare notes on their favorite ice cream flavors. "She spends so much time with babysitters and in after-school programs while I work." "Are you kidding?" David replied, watching Anaya patiently help Sophie navigate the complicated logistics of eating ice cream without making a mess. "She's confident, compassionate, academically gifted, and has the strongest moral compass of anyone I know. You're raising an extraordinary human being." Nicole smiled, the first truly relaxed expression he'd seen on her face. "She talks about wanting to be a doctor like me, but also a teacher and an artist and a veterinarian. I tell her she has time to figure it out." "What about you?" she asked. "What did you do before this?" David spooned some melted ice cream thoughtfully. "Marketing manager for a tech company. Thought I was climbing the ladder, building something meaningful. Turns out I was just making rich people richer while missing my daughter's childhood." "Do you regret it?" "The job? Yes. The marriage ending? That's complicated. But losing time with Sophie? That's the only thing that keeps me awake at night." As they prepared to leave, Anaya hugged Sophie goodbye and promised to save her a seat at lunch the next day if they ended up in the same cafeteria rotation. Nicole walked David to his car, a 10-year-old Honda that had seen better days but still ran reliably. "Thank you," David said, "for the ice cream, for the conversation, for raising a daughter who shows strangers more kindness than most people show their friends. Thank you for letting us help. Anaya's been learning about community service at school, but it means more when she can see it in action." That night, in their cramped apartment in Riverside Commons, a complex that had seen better decades, David tucked Sophie into bed. They'd moved here after the divorce, trading their suburban home with the white picket fence for a place he could afford on unemployment benefits. Sophie's bedroom was actually the dining room with a folding screen for privacy, but she'd decorated it with drawings and stuffed animals, making it unmistakably hers. The apartment told the story of their reduced circumstances. Furniture from their old house crammed into spaces too small, boxes still unpacked after 3 months because there was nowhere to put their contents, a refrigerator that hummed too loudly, and a heating system that couldn't decide between too hot and too cold. But Sophie had adapted with the resilience of childhood, finding joy in small spaces and treating their situation as an adventure rather than a catastrophe. "Daddy, are we poor now?" she asked suddenly, her brown eyes serious. She was lying in her single bed. They'd had to sell her canopy bed, set to pay for the security deposit, surrounded by stuffed animals that remembered better times. David sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. "We're going through a tough time, sweetheart, but we have each other, and apparently we have angels like Anaya and her mom looking out for us." I liked her. She's really smart, and she knew all the names of the ice cream flavors, even the weird ones. She did. What did you think of her mom? Sophie considered this with 6-year-old seriousness. She seems nice, and she looks at you the same way you look at me. How's that? Like you're proud of someone just for being who they are. David's breath caught. Sometimes children's observations cut straight to truths adults spent years avoiding. That's a very wise thing to notice. Will you find another job soon? I'm trying very hard. Sometimes it just takes time. After Sophie fell asleep, David sat at his laptop, scrolling through job listings he'd already applied to multiple times. The marketing field was oversaturated, and at 38, he was competing against younger candidates with more recent digital experience and fewer family obligations. Companies wanted social media experts who understood TikTok algorithms and influencer marketing, skills that hadn't existed when David was building his career around traditional advertising and brand management. His savings account showed a balance of $47. His checking account was worse. The child support payment was due in 2 weeks, and he had no idea where the money would come from. He'd already sold everything valuable: his watch, his golf clubs, Michelle's grandmother's ring that she'd left behind. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife, Michelle. "Sophie mentioned some incident at the store. We need to discuss your financial situation before the custody hearing next month. My lawyer has some concerns about your ability to provide adequate care." David stared at the message, his stomach churning. Michelle had been pushing for reduced custody since the divorce was finalized, claiming he couldn't provide adequate care for Sophie. Today's humiliation would only strengthen her case. He could imagine her lawyer's arguments. A man who can't afford groceries shouldn't have unsupervised access to a child. The custody arrangement they'd negotiated during the divorce gave David joint custody. Sophie spent weekdays with him and weekends with Michelle, plus alternating holidays. But that had been when David had a job and a stable income. Now Michelle was arguing for supervised visits only, claiming his unstable living situation posed a risk to Sophie's well-being. Unable to sleep, David walked to his small balcony and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Anaya and her mother were probably asleep in their own modest apartment, unaware that their simple act of kindness had saved not just his groceries, but something deeper: his faith that good people still existed. The view from his balcony encompassed the reality of urban struggle: a parking lot where teenagers gathered at night, the distant hum of the interstate carrying people to better places, apartment buildings filled with families trying to make ends meet. But for the first time in months, David didn't feel entirely alone in that landscape. The next morning, David dropped Sophie off at Riverside Elementary, a public school that served the complex mix of families in their transitioning neighborhood. The building was old but well-maintained, with colorful murals painted by students and a playground that showed signs of recent improvements. As he watched Sophie run toward the entrance, backpack bouncing, he felt the familiar pang of guilt about the changes in her life. Walking back to his car, David noticed a flyer on the community bulletin board advertising volunteer positions for the school's after-school tutoring program. If he couldn't find paying work immediately, maybe he could contribute something valuable while building references that might impress a family court judge, or at least show Michelle's lawyer that he was actively involved in education and child welfare. 3 days later, David swallowed what remained of his pride and walked into Riverside Elementary's main office. The school smelled like childhood: crayons and cafeteria food, and that particular scent of institutional cleaning supplies that somehow managed to be both harsh and comforting. Principal Rodriguez interviewed him in her cluttered office, surrounded by children's artwork and stacks of educational assessments. She was a woman in her 50s who radiated the no-nonsense warmth of someone who dedicated her life to helping children succeed against difficult odds. Her desk displayed photos of graduates alongside current students, creating a visual timeline of hope and achievement. "Our tutoring program serves students who are struggling with reading comprehension," she explained, gesturing to a chart showing test scores that told the story of persistent achievement gaps. Many come from single-parent households where English isn't the first language, or where parents work multiple jobs and can't provide homework help. We need committed volunteers who can work with children one-on-one, 3 afternoons a week. What kind of time commitment are we talking about? David asked, though he knew his schedule was painfully open. 2 hours each session, Monday through Wednesday. The children stay for the program instead of taking the regular bus home. We provide snacks and transportation afterward. David looked at the photo wall, seeing faces that reminded him of Sophie, of Anaya, of children who deserved every possible chance to succeed. I'd be honored to help. Principal Rodriguez smiled, the kind of expression that suggested she was used to measuring people's sincerity and had liked what she'd seen. The background check takes about a week. Can you start Monday after next? Absolutely. David paused. I should mention, I'm going through some personal challenges right now. Financial difficulties, a custody situation. I don't want to mislead you about my circumstances. Mr. Hartley, some of our best volunteers are people who understand what struggle looks like. The children can sense authenticity, and they respond to adults who've faced real challenges. That afternoon, David picked up Sophie from her regular after-school program and took her to the park near their apartment complex. It wasn't much. A few swings, a slide that needed painting, and a basketball court with nets worn thin by weather and use. But Sophie loved it, and the playground was usually busy enough that she could find other children to play with. Dad, there's Anaya. Sophie pointed toward the entrance, where Nicole was walking with her daughter. Both were carrying grocery bags, and Anaya was skipping beside her mother in the way children do when they're happy and secure. Should we go say hello? David asked, trying to keep his voice casual while his heart rate picked up slightly. Sophie was already running toward them. Anaya, want to swing with me? Nicole approached more slowly, smiling at David with the kind of warmth that suggested their ice cream outing had meant something to her too. Fancy meeting you here. How was your day? Actually pretty good. I just volunteered to tutor at Sophie's school. It's not paid work, but it's something meaningful while I keep job hunting. That's wonderful. Anaya would probably love having you around school more often. She's mentioned you several times since Tuesday. They sat on a bench while their daughters played, falling into the kind of easy conversation that felt both new and familiar. Nicole talked about her residency, the challenges of learning to be a doctor while single parenting, the way Anaya had adapted to their circumstances with remarkable resilience. Some nights I fall asleep while helping with her homework, Nicole admitted. I worry I'm not giving her enough attention, enough stability. From what I can see, you're giving her everything that matters. Love, consistency, high expectations balanced with unconditional support. That's more than a lot of kids get from parents who have unlimited time and resources. Nicole looked at him curiously. You talk like someone who's thought a lot about parenting philosophy. Forced to, recently. When you're fighting for custody, you have to articulate exactly what kind of parent you are and why that matters. Is the custody situation complicated? David found himself telling her about the divorce, the job loss, Michelle's arguments that Sophie needed stability he couldn't provide. Nicole listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions that suggested she understood both the legal and emotional complexities of their situation. What does Sophie think about all this? She asked finally. She doesn't know the details. She knows we moved to a smaller place, that money is tight, that I'm looking for work. But she's still fundamentally secure in believing that I'll take care of her. That's the most important thing. Children can handle almost any external change as long as they feel emotionally safe with their primary caregiver. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the playground, their daughters returned breathless and grass-stained from playing. Anaya had found a 4-leaf clover, which she carefully placed in Sophie's palm. For good luck, she said solemnly. My teacher says they're magic. Sophie examined the clover with the reverence children reserve for truly special gifts. Thank you. I'll keep it forever. Walking back to the parking area, Nicole hesitated before getting into her car. David, would you and Sophie like to come over for dinner Friday night? Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and salad. Anaya's been asking if she can have a play date. David felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but a crack in the wall of loneliness he'd built around himself. We'd love that. The following Monday, David entered Riverside Elementary's library for his first tutoring session. The space was cramped and underfunded, with mismatched furniture and books held together with tape, but it buzzed with quiet energy. 8 children sat around 2 small tables, their ages ranging from about 7 to 10, their expressions mixing curiosity with the wariness that comes from academic struggles, including a familiar face. "Mr. David," Anaya beamed when she saw him, "you came to help us learn." Principal Rodriguez introduced him to the other children and Ms. Martinez, the teacher who coordinated the program. Marcus was a quiet boy who'd been held back a grade and had developed anxiety around reading aloud. Destiny was academically capable, but came from a household where English was rarely spoken, leaving her confused by idioms and cultural references that native speakers took for granted. Luis had been diagnosed with dyslexia, but hadn't received proper intervention until recently. Each child carried their own story of potential complicated by circumstances beyond their control. The goal isn't just improved test scores, Ms. Martinez explained quietly while the children organized their materials. We want them to discover that reading can be enjoyable, that learning is something they're capable of, that adults can be trusted to help them succeed. David spent that first session mostly observing, learning each child's personality and particular challenges. Anaya was clearly one of the stronger readers, but had been placed in the program because she finished her regular classwork quickly and needed enrichment activities. She naturally gravitated toward helping younger children, demonstrating the same instinct for service her mother had shown at the grocery store. Marcus struggled with confidence more than ability. When asked to read aloud, his voice became barely audible, and he frequently stopped to apologize for mistakes that weren't actually errors. Destiny had an impressive vocabulary, but stumbled over cultural context. Luis worked twice as hard as everyone else to decode words that came easily to his peers. But his comprehension was excellent once he'd worked through the mechanical challenges. Over the next several weeks, David threw himself into the volunteer work with an intensity that surprised him. He stayed late researching teaching techniques, created engaging games to make reading fun, and spent his weekends developing reward systems for the children's progress. The local library became his second home as he checked out professional development books about literacy education, learning disabilities, and trauma-informed teaching. The work gave him a sense of purpose he'd been missing since losing his job. In the corporate world, success had been measured by quarterly reports and profit margins that felt abstract and removed from real human impact. Here, progress was immediate and visible. A child successfully reading a paragraph they'd struggled with the week before, the light in someone's eyes when a story finally made sense, the gradual building of confidence that came from consistent support and encouragement. The kids responded to his patience and genuine investment in their success. Marcus began reading with more confidence after David created a system where children earned points for effort rather than perfection. Destiny discovered she had a gift for creative writing when David encouraged her to incorporate her bilingual experiences into storytelling. Luis overcame his fear of reading aloud by practicing with David in one-on-one sessions that focused on his comprehension strengths. Most surprisingly, Anaya became David's unofficial teaching assistant, helping other children with the kind of intuitive understanding of learning differences that suggested she might become an exceptional educator herself. She had a gift for explaining concepts in different ways, until something clicked, and she never made other children feel stupid for needing help. Nicole often arrived early to pick up Anaya, and she and David began talking beyond simple pleasantries. She would bring him coffee before tutoring sessions, and they'd discuss their children, their work, their hopes for futures that seemed increasingly uncertain, but somehow more hopeful when shared. "Anaya says you're the best teacher she's ever had," Nicole said one evening as they walked to the parking lot. "She wants to start a reading club at home for the neighborhood kids. She has incredible instincts for helping others learn. Have you considered getting her tested for the gifted program?" "I've thought about it, but those programs are so competitive, and she's already thriving academically. Plus, I worry about putting too much pressure on her." "Saint-Adid." David nodded, understanding the delicate balance of encouraging a child's potential without creating unhealthy expectations. "What does she want?" "To be like you and me, someone who helps people feel better. She's not sure yet if that means being a doctor or a teacher, but she knows she wants to spend her life in service." Their friendship deepened over the weeks. Nicole would bring David coffee before tutoring sessions, and they'd discuss their children, their struggles, their hopes for futures that seemed increasingly uncertain. David found himself looking forward to these conversations more than anything else in his week. But the financial pressure was mounting relentlessly. David's unemployment benefits were running out, and he'd received only form rejections to his job applications. The language was always similar. "We've decided to move forward with other candidates," or "Your qualifications are impressive, but we found someone who better fits our current needs." The subtext was clear. He was overqualified for entry-level positions and underqualified for roles at his former level, caught in the purgatory of career transition that left him unemployable in either direction. The custody hearing loomed, and Michelle's lawyer had been asking pointed questions about his living situation and employment status. David's legal aid attorney had warned him that his financial instability was a serious concern for the court, particularly combined with his inability to maintain their previous standard of living. 6 weeks into his volunteer work, David's fragile equilibrium began to crumble. The first crack came in the form of an unexpected visit from Michelle herself, who arrived at Riverside Elementary unannounced, watching through the library window as he worked with the children. Her expression was a mixture of surprise and calculated interest as she observed him patiently helping Marcus sound out a difficult passage, while Anaya encouraged Luis through a creative writing exercise. After the session, she confronted him in the parking lot, her voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who'd once loved you, but now viewed you as an obstacle to be managed. "This is what you're doing instead of finding real work. Playing teacher while I pay all of Sophie's medical bills and school expenses." "I'm still applying for positions every day," David said quietly, aware that several parents were watching the confrontation with uncomfortable curiosity. Michelle looked polished and successful in her business suit and luxury car, the visual representation of the life David had lost. Her blonde hair was professionally styled, her makeup perfect, her confidence intact in ways that made David acutely aware of his own decline. "The custody hearing is next week, David. Do you honestly think a judge will be impressed by your charity work when you can't even pay child support?" Her words stung because they contained an uncomfortable truth. David had fallen behind on his support payments, and his small apartment barely met the court's minimum standards for overnight custody. The legal aid attorney had warned him that his volunteer work, while admirable, wouldn't outweigh his financial instability in the eyes of a family court judge. "I'm contributing to my community and helping children succeed academically. That has to count for something. It counts for nothing if you can't afford to house and feed your own child. Sophie needs stability, not a father who's playing make-believe teacher while living in poverty." That evening, David sat in his apartment staring at eviction notices and past due bills spread across his small dining table. The mathematics were unforgiving. His unemployment benefits would end in 2 weeks. He was 3 weeks behind on rent. His car payment was overdue, and he had $17 in his checking account. Sophie was spending the night with Michelle, their standard Wednesday arrangement, so David was alone with his fears and his failures. The apartment felt particularly cramped and shabby in the aftermath of Michelle's visit, filled with reminders of everything he'd lost and couldn't provide. His phone rang around 9 p.m. Nicole's name appeared on the screen. "David, I heard what happened from Anaya. She said there was drama at school pickup, and Sophie looked upset. Is everything okay?" David found himself telling her about the confrontation, about his financial situation, about the custody hearing that could result in losing daily access to the person who mattered most to him. "I should have focused on job hunting instead of playing teacher," he said bitterly. "Maybe Michelle was right about my priorities." "Don't you dare diminish what you've done." "Do you know what Anaya's reading level was when you started working with her?" "She was already a strong reader." "She was testing 2 grades behind in reading comprehension. The school was considering holding her back because she couldn't demonstrate understanding of complex text. Now she's reading above grade level and helping tutor younger children. You did that." David was quiet, processing this information. He'd assumed Anaya was in the program for enrichment, not remediation. And Marcus? He started the year refusing to read aloud at all. Yesterday I heard him reading a book report to his grandmother over the phone. Luis is writing stories for the first time in his life. Destiny just tested into the advanced English class. Nicole, these children's lives are different because of you. Their families are grateful in ways you probably don't even understand. That matters more than any quarterly profit report you ever generated. Doesn't matter to the family court system. There was a pause, and when Nicole spoke again, her voice was softer. "What can I do to help?" "There's nothing anyone can do. I made my choices, and now I'm facing the consequences." "David, I need to tell you something. I've been offered a position at Children's Hospital in Chicago. Significant pay increase, better hours, better opportunities for advancement. Anaya would attend one of the top elementary schools in the state." David's heart sank further. Of course she would leave. Why would she stay in a city with limited opportunities when she could give her daughter so much more? "Congratulations. Anaya deserves every advantage you can give her." I turned it down. David was quiet for a moment, processing her words. "Why would you do that?" "Because Anaya has never had a consistent male role model until she met you. Because she talks about you with the kind of respect and admiration I thought she'd never feel for a man after what her father did. Because she's thriving academically and socially in ways I haven't seen before." Nicole paused, and David could hear her taking a deep breath. "And because I've never trusted anyone the way I trust you. Because when I watch you with those children, I see someone who understands what really matters. Because I'm falling in love with the man you're becoming, not the one you used to be." The words hung in the air between them, complicated by timing and circumstances that made them both precious and impossible. "Nicole, the custody ruling means I might only be allowed supervised visits with my own daughter. I'm not exactly stable role model material right now. Then we'll figure it out together. All of us." That weekend, during his scheduled time with Sophie, David struggled to maintain normalcy while his world crumbled around him. They went to the free museum, played at the park, and made dinner together in his tiny kitchen. But Sophie was perceptive enough to sense his distress, and her attempts to cheer him up only made his heart break more. "Daddy, why was Mommy angry at your school?" she asked, as they cleaned up after dinner. Spaghetti with jarred sauce, the kind of meal that had become their standard when money was tight. David chose his words carefully. Mommy's worried about money. Sometimes adults fight about money when they're scared about the future. But you're helping kids learn to read better. Anaya says you're the best teacher she's ever had, and she's really smart. David's heart swelled and broke simultaneously. Thank you, sweetheart. Helping those children has been the most meaningful thing I've done in a long time. Sophie considered this seriously, while drying a plate with a dish towel that was too big for her small hands. Are you going to keep teaching them even if you get a different job? I hope so. What do you think I should do? I think you should do what makes kids happy and helps them learn stuff. That seems more important than making lots of money. Out of the mouths of babes, David thought, hugging his daughter close and wondering how he'd gotten so lucky to have someone so wise in his life. The custody hearing took place the following Tuesday in a downtown courthouse that smelled like old wood and broken dreams. David sat at a small table with his legal aid attorney, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who was clearly overworked but genuinely committed to helping families navigate impossible situations. Michelle's lawyer was everything David couldn't afford. Expensive suit, confident manner, briefcase full of documents designed to prove that David was an unfit parent. The arguments were predictable but effective. His unemployment, his reduced living circumstances, his inability to maintain financial stability, his dependence on public assistance. Judge Williams was a stern woman in her 60s who'd probably heard thousands of similar cases. She reviewed David's financial documents with obvious concern, occasionally glancing at him over her reading glasses in ways that suggested she'd already reached her conclusion. Mr. Hartley, you've been unemployed for over 2 months and are significantly behind on child support payments. You're living in a one-bedroom apartment and surviving on unemployment benefits that are about to expire. How can you provide adequate care for your daughter? David's legal aid attorney did her best, presenting character references from Principal Rodriguez and other school staff, emphasizing his volunteer work and community involvement. But the facts were damning, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Your Honor, David said when given the opportunity to speak, I understand the court's concerns about my financial situation. I've been actively seeking employment while contributing to my community through literacy tutoring. I've helped improve the reading skills of dozens of children who were struggling academically. That's admirable, Mr. Hartley, but it doesn't pay rent or child support, Judge Williams interrupted. The court's primary concern is the child's welfare, which requires stability and adequate resources. Michelle's lawyer painted a picture of an irresponsible man who chose volunteer work over gainful employment, whose financial instability posed a direct risk to Sophie's well-being. He presented evidence of David's eviction notices, his failure to maintain their previous standard of living, his dependence on food assistance programs. Mr. Hartley had a successful career and threw it away through poor life choices. He now expects the court to prioritize his relationship with his daughter over her need for stability and security. When it was over, Judge Williams delivered her ruling with the kind of professional compassion that managed to be both kind and devastating. I'm modifying custody to supervised visits only, every other weekend, until you can demonstrate consistent employment and financial stability for a period of at least 6 months. The court recognizes your love for your daughter and your positive impact in the community, but cannot ignore the practical realities of child welfare. David's world collapsed in that moment. He would lose daily access to the person who mattered most to him, all because he couldn't find a job that would hire a middle-aged marketing manager in an oversaturated field. Sophie, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, ran to him with tears in her eyes. I don't want to live somewhere else all the time, Daddy. I want to stay with you, too. David held her close, trying to be strong while his heart shattered. You'll still see me, sweetheart. Every other weekend, and I'll call you every day. But who will read bedtime stories with me on school nights? He couldn't answer that without breaking down completely. That evening, David sat in his apartment, staring at the custody modification papers. Through the thin walls, he could hear his neighbors' television, their arguments, their children playing. His own space felt impossibly quiet and empty without Sophie's laughter and chatter filling the rooms. The refrigerator hummed its mechanical song. The clock on the stove marked time he no longer knew how to fill. The books he'd checked out for tutoring lessons sat on his coffee table, reminders of work he was passionate about, but that couldn't support his basic needs. His phone rang around 8 p.m. Nicole's name on the screen. David, I heard what happened. Anaya said Sophie was crying at school today and wouldn't talk about why. I'm so sorry. I lost her, David said quietly. The one thing in my life that I couldn't afford to lose, and I lost her. You didn't lose her. The court modified the custody arrangement temporarily. There's a difference. Nicole, I can't even pay my rent. My unemployment runs out next week, and I've had exactly 0 callbacks on job applications in the past month. How am I supposed to demonstrate financial stability when no one will hire me? There was a long pause. What if I told you I had an idea? What kind of idea? The kind that might sound crazy, but could change everything. The next morning, Nicole arrived at David's apartment with coffee and a laptop bag, looking more determined than he'd ever seen her. She'd arranged for Anaya to spend the morning with a neighbor so they could talk without interruption. I've been thinking about your situation all night, she said, settling onto his couch with the kind of focused energy that suggested she'd already made decisions. You're looking for traditional employment in a field that's not hiring people with your profile. But what if you created your own opportunity? I don't have capital to start a business, Nicole. I can barely afford groceries. What if you didn't need capital? What if you just needed expertise and passion and community support? She opened her laptop and showed him research she'd compiled overnight. Statistics about literacy rates in their city, information about grant funding for educational programs, examples of successful community-based tutoring organizations in other cities. The reading scores at Riverside Elementary have improved dramatically since you started volunteering. Principal Rodriguez told me the district is taking notice. Other schools are asking about replicating the program. David studied the information, beginning to see where she was going with this. You're suggesting I try to create a non-profit organization? I'm suggesting you do what you're already doing, but on a larger scale and with sustainable funding. There are federal grants, state funding, foundation money available for literacy programs that can demonstrate results. Pause. She pulled up another screen showing grant application deadlines and funding amounts. Some of these are specifically designed for people who want to create innovative educational programs. The application process takes time, but if you could get even one grant approval, you'd have seed money to expand the tutoring program and pay yourself a modest salary. David felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, but possibility. This would take months to develop, even if I got funding. The custody modification requires me to show financial stability within 6 months. So you get a part-time job to cover basic expenses while you build the nonprofit. Food service, retail, whatever pays the bills while you work on the bigger picture. The idea was simultaneously terrifying and energizing. David had spent his entire career working within established corporate structures, following predetermined paths to success. The thought of creating something from nothing, of building an organization around his own vision and values, was daunting but also incredibly appealing. Why are you helping me with this? he asked. "You barely know me, and you're investing your time and energy into solving my problems." Nicole was quiet for a moment, staring at her laptop screen. "Because Anaya has never talked about anyone the way she talks about you. Because I see how you interact with those children, and I know you're exactly the kind of person who should be working in education. Because I believe in what you're doing, and I want to see you succeed." She looked up at him then, her expression vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "And because I'm in love with you, and I want to build a life together. But that can only happen if you're emotionally and financially stable enough to be a full partner." The admission hung between them, honest and complicated and wonderful. "I'm in love with you too," David said quietly. "Have been since the day you and Anaya saved my dignity at Henderson's Market. But I'm scared of pulling you into my mess. I'm already in your mess. The question is whether we're going to figure it out together or separately." 3 weeks after the custody hearing, Principal Rodriguez called David into her office. He assumed she was ending his volunteer service due to the negative publicity from his legal troubles, but instead she surprised him with an unexpected opportunity. "The district is creating a new position," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "Part-time literacy coordinator, to expand our tutoring programs district-wide. The pay is modest, $34,000 annually, but it comes with benefits and real potential for growth." David stared at her, hardly daring to hope. "You're offering me a job. I'm saying you should apply. The position was created specifically because of the success you've had here. Our reading scores have improved dramatically since you started, and we have waiting lists of children who want to participate in the program." "Principal Rodriguez, my background check shows the custody case, my financial problems. It shows a man who put his child's needs first and his community's needs second, even when it cost him personally. It shows someone who understands that education is about more than test scores. It's about believing in potential that others might overlook." She slid an application packet across her desk. "The interview process is thorough, and you'll be competing against credentialed teachers with advanced degrees. But you have something they don't have. You've proven that you can reach children who've been written off by the system." CT. The application process took 3 weeks and was more rigorous than any corporate job interview David had experienced. He interviewed with panels that included Principal Rodriguez, the district superintendent, several school board members, and parent representatives from schools throughout the district. He spoke passionately about literacy education, community engagement, and the untapped potential he saw in every struggling reader. He presented data showing the improved test scores and engagement levels among the children he'd tutored. He outlined his vision for expanding the program to serve more schools while maintaining the personalized approach that had made it effective. "These children don't just need someone to hear them read," he told the panel during his final interview. "They need someone to believe in their capacity for growth, someone who shows up consistently, someone who proves that adults can be trusted to keep their promises." When the call came offering him the position, David was in the school library, working with his Tuesday reading group. Anaya was reading a passage from Island of the Blue Dolphins aloud, her voice confident and expressive, while Marcus and Luis followed along in their own copies. "Mr. David, why do you look like you're going to cry?" Anaya asked when she finished the chapter, her perceptive eyes studying his face with concern. "Sometimes good news makes grown-ups emotional, sweetheart. I just got offered a real job helping kids learn to read." The entire tutoring group erupted in cheers and applause. Marcus high-fived Luis, Destiny grinned widely, and Anaya launched herself into David's arms for a celebratory hug. "Does this mean you'll keep teaching us?" she asked. "It means I'll be teaching even more children, and you're going to help me figure out how to do it best." The position offered hope, but not immediate relief from his custody situation. David would need several months of stable employment before he could petition the court for modification. The supervised visits continued, but now they carried the possibility of change rather than the certainty of permanent loss. 6 months into his new role, David had expanded the literacy program to 5 schools throughout the district. He'd recruited 30 volunteer tutors, secured grant funding for new books and educational materials, and developed assessment tools that other districts were requesting to use in their own programs. More importantly, he'd found his calling in life. The work was demanding, longer hours than his corporate job had required, significantly less pay than he'd been accustomed to, constant pressure to prove the program's value through data and results. But it was also deeply meaningful in ways that quarterly profit reports had never been. Each success story reinforced his sense of purpose. Marcus had been selected for the gifted reading program and was now tutoring younger children himself. Destiny had won a district-wide creative writing contest with a bilingual story that celebrated her multicultural identity. Luis had overcome his dyslexia-related challenges enough to read at grade level, and was considering becoming a special education teacher when he grew up. Nicole had remained in the city, accepting a position at the community health center that paid less than the Chicago offer, but allowed her to build something meaningful in the place where Anaya was thriving. She and David had grown closer, their friendship evolving into a partnership that felt both inevitable and carefully chosen. On a Saturday morning in early spring, David picked up Sophie for their supervised visit at the community center. Mrs. Patterson, the court-appointed monitor, had become an advocate for increased custody as she witnessed David's consistent, devoted parenting over the months. "Daddy, can we visit your new office today?" Sophie asked as they walked to his car. The question had become a ritual. She was fascinated by the work he was doing and proud of his success in ways that humbled him. "Of course, I want to show you the new reading corner we just set up for the summer program." At the district offices, David led Sophie through hallways lined with photos from various school literacy programs. They stopped at a bulletin board displaying success stories, children who'd improved multiple grade levels, families who'd begun reading together at home, teenagers who'd discovered a love for literature through the program. "Look at this," David said, pointing to a photo of Anaya holding a certificate for reading 100 books in a school year. "Remember the girl who helped us at the grocery store?" Sophie nodded, examining the photo with the kind of careful attention she gave to things that mattered to her. "She's now one of our student mentors, helping younger children develop confidence with reading. She's also been accepted to a summer program for gifted students at the university." "Because you taught her?" "Because she worked incredibly hard, and I got to help support her effort. There's a difference." Sophie studied the wall of achievements and testimonials with the seriousness of someone trying to understand the adult world. "Daddy, are you happy with your new job?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. Sophie had always been perceptive, but her emotional intelligence seemed to be developing at an accelerated pace as she navigated the complexities of divorced parents and changing family dynamics. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Before, when you lived with Mommy and worked at the other place, you were always stressed and tired and talking on the phone about numbers and meetings. Now you seem, I don't know, like you fit better in your own skin." David knelt to Sophie's eye level, struck by her insight. "I am happier, sweetheart. Not about being away from you. That's still the hardest part of my life. But I'm happy about the work I'm doing and the person I'm becoming. Even though you don't make as much money. Even though I don't make as much money. Turns out there are more important things than having the biggest house or the nicest car." That afternoon, Nicole and Anaya joined them at the park. The four of them had developed a routine of weekend outings when David's custody schedule allowed, creating the kind of chosen family that forms around shared values rather than blood relations. Sophie and Anaya had become close friends, bonding over books, art projects, and the shared experience of having dedicated single parents who'd found each other through circumstances neither had planned. They played together with the comfortable familiarity of siblings, while David and Nicole watched from a nearby bench, their own relationship deepening with each shared moment. "The custody review hearing is scheduled for next month," David said, as they watched their daughters attempt to build an elaborate fort out of playground equipment and their combined collection of stuffed animals. "Are you ready?" Nicole asked, though she'd been helping him prepare documents and practice testimony for weeks. "I think so. Mrs. Patterson is going to testify on my behalf. Principal Rodriguez wrote a detailed letter for the court, and my finances are finally stable. I've been consistent with support payments for 6 months. I have health insurance through the district, and my apartment passes all the court's safety requirements." Nicole was quiet for a moment, watching Anaya patiently teach Sophie how to braid friendship bracelets using colorful embroidery floss. "What happens if you get joint custody back?" "That's what I want most in the world. Well, almost most." "What's the most?" David turned to face her fully, taking her hand in his. "Building a life with you. All of us together." Nicole smiled, the kind of expression that suggested she'd been hoping he would say exactly that. "David, I need to tell you something I've been thinking about." "What?" "I want us to be a family. Not just friends who care about each other, not just two single parents helping each other through difficult times. I want to build something permanent together." David's heart rate increased as he processed what she was saying. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you think we're ready to make that kind of commitment. To each other, and to both girls." He looked across the playground at Sophie and Anaya, who had abandoned the friendship bracelets in favor of a complex game involving their stuffed animals, elaborate backstories, and what appeared to be a quest to save the playground from an invasion of invisible dragons. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he said quietly. "But I want to make sure we're doing this for the right reasons. Not just because we're both single parents who've been through trauma, but because we genuinely believe we can build something better together than we could separately." Nicole squeezed his hand. "David, when I watch you with those children at school, when I see how you've rebuilt your life around service instead of self-interest, when I notice how Sophie looks at you with complete trust, even after everything you've been through, I see the kind of person I want to spend my life with. And when I see how you balance demanding work with devoted parenting, how you raised a daughter who offers $10 to strangers in need, how you've supported my dreams even when they didn't directly benefit you, I see the kind of partner I never thought I'd be lucky enough to find." They kissed there on the park bench while their daughters played, two adults who had found each other through crisis and community service, and the kind of deep friendship that grows into lasting love. The custody review hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in late spring. David wore his best suit, a purchase he'd been able to afford with his stable income, and carried a comprehensive folder documenting his transformation. Employment records, pay stubs, letters of recommendation, evidence of his improved living situation, and testimonials from families whose children had benefited from his programs. Judge Williams reviewed the materials with the same thoroughness she'd shown 9 months earlier, but her demeanor was markedly different. Less skeptical, more hopeful. The courtroom felt different, too, less like a place of judgment and more like a space where positive change could be recognized and rewarded. "Mr. Hartley, I see substantial changes in your circumstances. Steady employment with opportunities for advancement, adequate housing, consistent support payments, and overwhelmingly positive reports from the supervised visit monitor. Yes, Your Honor. I've also been able to save enough money for Sophie's college fund and have secured health insurance that covers all her medical needs. I also have letters from your employer, school principals, parents of children you tutor, and community members. It appears you've not only stabilized your situation, but found a way to contribute meaningfully to society while supporting your daughter appropriately. Michelle's lawyer tried to argue that David's salary was still modest compared to his previous income, and that his work with at-risk children might expose Sophie to inappropriate influences. But the evidence of his complete life transformation was overwhelming. Mrs. Patterson testified that she'd observed a devoted father who prioritized his daughter's emotional, educational, and developmental needs above his own comfort. Principal Rodriguez spoke about David's impact on literacy rates throughout the district. Nicole provided a character reference that emphasized his integrity, reliability, and positive influence on her own daughter. Mr. Hartley, Judge Williams said finally, I'm granting your petition for custody modification. We'll return to the original joint custody arrangement, with the stipulation that any missed support payments or housing instability will result in immediate review. David's knees nearly buckled with relief. Sophie, who had been sitting with Michelle, ran to him for a hug that seemed to last forever. Through the embrace, he saw Michelle's expression, not happiness, but a grudging acceptance that suggested she recognized the man he'd become was different from the one she'd divorced. I get to have sleepovers at your house again? Sophie whispered into his ear. Every other week, just like before. And I'll pick you up from school on Wednesdays, and we'll do homework together, and I'll read you bedtime stories. That evening, David hosted a celebration dinner at his apartment, now a proper two-bedroom place that he could afford comfortably. Nicole brought Anaya and a homemade cake decorated with books and pencils. Sophie chattered excitedly about splitting time between houses again and having sleepovers with Anaya when their schedules aligned. The apartment felt transformed by the presence of all three of them. No longer the lonely space of a struggling single father, but the warm, lived-in home of a man who'd learned to build community around shared meals and meaningful conversation. After the girls went to bed, Sophie in her own room for the first time in months, Anaya on an air mattress for a planned sleepover, David and Nicole sat on his small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and looking out at the city lights that no longer seemed threatening or indifferent. 11 months ago, I was a different person, David said, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small object. It was Anaya's original $10 bill, now framed and protected but still carried as a reminder. Nicole smiled when she saw it. You kept it. I keep it to remember that accepting help isn't failure. It's human. And that sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is to focus on helping others. What happens now? Nicole asked. We have stable jobs, healthy children, a custody arrangement that works. We've built something good here. David set down his wine glass and turned to face her fully. Now, I ask you something I should have asked months ago. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Nicole's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. Nicole Johnson, you and Anaya saved my life that day at Henderson's Market, not just financially, but spiritually. You taught me that community isn't something you're born into. It's something you build through consistent acts of service and love. He opened the box to reveal a modest but beautiful engagement ring. Will you marry me? Will you help me build a family that's based on the values we've discovered together? Nicole's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. Yes, absolutely yes. But I have one condition. What's that? We do this right. We talk to both girls about what it means to become a family. We make sure they're excited about it, and not just going along with what the adults want. We build something that honors what we've learned about putting children first. Deal, David said, slipping the ring onto her finger. Although I think you'll find that our daughters have been planning this longer than we have. As if summoned by their conversation, both girls appeared at the sliding door to the balcony, wearing pajamas and conspiratorial grins. "Did he ask you yet?" Anaya whispered loudly. "Did you say yes?" Sophie added. Nicole and David looked at each other and burst into laughter. "How long have you two been listening?" "Long enough," Sophie said pragmatically. "We already decided we want to be sisters, so you guys needed to catch up." Anaya nodded seriously. "Also, we think you should have the wedding at the school library, because that's where you fell in love helping kids learn to read." 6 months later, David Hartley stood at the altar of a small community church, watching Nicole walk down the aisle in a simple ivory dress that made her look radiant. Sophie and Anaya served as flower girls, grinning with excitement about officially becoming sisters and wearing matching dresses they'd helped choose. The wedding reception was held at Riverside Elementary, in the library that David had helped transform through grants and community donations. His literacy program now served 12 schools and over 400 children annually. The walls were covered with photos of reading achievements, high school graduations, college acceptance letters, and thank you notes from families whose lives had been touched by the program. Principal Rodriguez served as the unofficial master of ceremonies, telling stories about David's impact on the district and Nicole's contributions to community health. Mrs. Patterson attended with her husband, having become a family friend rather than a court-appointed monitor. Even Michelle was present, having gradually come to respect the man David had become and the positive influence he had on Sophie's life. The cake was decorated with books and medical symbols, representing both their professions and their shared commitment to service. Instead of traditional wedding favors, they'd created a small lending library where guests could take a book and leave a book, symbolizing their belief that knowledge and stories should be shared freely. Nicole Hartley maintained her professional name, but enthusiastically embraced the family they'd created together. David had been promoted to District Director of Community Education, overseeing not just literacy programs, but also adult education, family engagement initiatives, and community partnerships that connected schools with local organizations. But their success was measured differently now than it had been in their previous lives. It wasn't about accumulating wealth or status symbols or climbing corporate ladders. It was about Sophie's confidence as she read advanced chapter books and helped tutor younger children at the community center. It was about Anaya's ambition to become a teacher and her pride in the community service projects she organized at school. It was about former students who visited to share news of their achievements and the dreams they were pursuing because someone had believed in their potential. On quiet Sunday mornings, David would sometimes drive past Henderson's Market, the place where his transformation had begun, with a moment of profound humiliation followed by unexpected grace. The store looked exactly the same. Same flickering neon sign. Same worn parking lot. Same automatic doors that had witnessed his lowest moment and his first step toward redemption. But he was unrecognizable as the desperate man who had stood frozen at that checkout line 3 years earlier. That man had measured his worth by his job title and bank balance, had believed that success was about individual achievement and accumulating possessions. This man measured his worth by the children who improved their reading levels, the families who found hope through education, the community that had grown stronger through collective effort. That man had been terrified of appearing weak or needy, had seen asking for help as a sign of failure. This man had learned that vulnerability was the price of authentic connection and meaningful service, that the people worth knowing were those who offered help without judgment and accepted help without shame. The grocery store had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, not because anything miraculous had happened there, but because it represented the moment when everything changed, when a little girl's simple generosity had cracked open his heart and allowed light to enter spaces that had been dark with pride and fear and the lonely desperation of someone who'd lost his way. David kept Anaya's original $10 bill framed in his office, beneath a small plaque that read, "Pay it forward. That's how community works." Below that was a photo from their wedding reception, showing him and Nicole surrounded by dozens of children and families whose lives had been touched by their programs. The office itself told the story of what they'd built together. Walls covered with certificates of appreciation from schools and community organizations. Shelves lined with educational resources and children's books. A corner where small chairs surrounded a reading table for the tutoring sessions he still conducted twice a week. But the most meaningful decoration was a hand-drawn poster that Anaya and Sophie had created together, showing stick figures of their blended family beneath the words, "Love makes us stronger." It hung behind David's desk, where he could see it during every phone call with principals, every grant application meeting, every moment when he needed to remember why the work mattered. Because the work did matter, in ways that quarterly profit reports and performance bonuses never had. When Marcus graduated from high school and received a scholarship to study education, when Destiny's bilingual children's book was published by a small press, when Luis overcame his learning differences enough to become a peer tutor himself, those victories felt more significant than any corporate achievement David had ever accomplished. The literacy program had evolved beyond what anyone had imagined in those early days of volunteer tutoring. It now included family engagement components that taught parents how to support their children's reading development, summer camps that prevented learning loss during school breaks, and partnerships with local libraries and bookstores that provided ongoing resources for participating families. More importantly, it had created a model that other districts were replicating. David regularly spoke at education conferences, sharing the philosophy that had emerged from his work: that children learn best when they feel seen and valued as individuals, that academic success requires addressing the whole child, including their emotional and social needs, that community partnerships can provide resources and support that schools can't offer alone. But for all the professional recognition and program expansion, the most meaningful moments still happened at the individual level, when a child who'd struggled with reading confidence successfully completed their first chapter book, when a family discovered the joy of reading together at bedtime, when a former student visited to share news of their college acceptance or career success. On a Tuesday evening in late spring, 3 years after the wedding, David was packing up his office after a long day of meetings when he heard a familiar voice in the hallway. "Mr. David, is that really you?" He turned to see Marcus, now 19 and home from his first year of college, standing in the doorway with a huge grin on his face. The quiet boy who'd once whispered his way through reading assignments had grown into a confident young man studying elementary education. "Marcus, what brings you back to the district office?" "I'm doing my practicum at Riverside Elementary next semester, and I wanted to thank you again for everything you did. I don't think I ever told you properly. You changed my life." David felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You changed your own life through hard work and persistence. I just got to be part of your support system." "No, it was more than that. You showed me that reading could be enjoyable instead of terrifying. You taught me that making mistakes was part of learning instead of something to be ashamed of. You proved that adults could be trusted to help instead of just criticize." Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want to teach because of you. I want to help kids who feel the way I felt, like they're not smart enough, like they'll never be good at school, like the adults have already given up on them." After Marcus left, David sat in his quiet office thinking about the ripple effects of that day at Henderson's Market. Anaya's $10 bill had saved his grocery shopping, but her mother's friendship had saved his soul. The volunteer tutoring had given him purpose, but the children had given him perspective on what really mattered in life. Nicole found him there an hour later, still sitting in the dark with only the hallway light illuminating his office. She'd finished her shift at the community health center and come to drive him home, knowing he sometimes lost track of time when he was reflecting on the work. "Long day?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Good day." Marcus stopped by. "He's doing his student teaching here next semester." Nicole smiled. "That's wonderful. Full circle." "I was thinking about what you said that night after the custody hearing, about how sometimes the end of one chapter is really the beginning of a better story." "What about it?" "I think we've written a pretty good story. Not the one I thought I wanted when I was focused on corporate success and suburban conformity, but something better. Something that matters." Nicole reached across the desk to take his hand. "What do you think happens in the next chapter?" David considered this question seriously. Sophie was thriving academically and socially, developing into a confident young person who shared her parents' commitment to community service. Anaya was preparing to apply for the district's early admission program for gifted students, while also volunteering as a reading buddy for younger children. The literacy program was expanding to include adult education components and family engagement initiatives that addressed multiple generations within the same households. "I think the next chapter is about sustainability," he said finally. "Making sure these programs can continue and grow even if we're not personally managing every detail. Training other people to do this work so it becomes bigger than just our individual efforts." "Sounds like you're thinking about legacy." "I'm thinking about impact that outlasts the people who create it. About building something strong enough to survive and flexible enough to evolve." They drove home together through neighborhoods that had become familiar and comfortable. Past Henderson's Market, past the elementary schools where David's programs operated, past the community health center where Nicole treated patients who couldn't afford private medical care. The city looked different to them now than it had 3 years ago, less like a place they'd ended up by circumstance, and more like a place they'd chosen to build their lives. At home, they found Sophie and Anaya doing homework together at the kitchen table, their books and papers spread across the surface in organized chaos. At 15 and 16, they'd grown into young women who shared not just a household, but a genuine sisterhood built on mutual respect and shared values. "How was school today?" Nicole asked, kissing both girls on the tops of their heads. "Good," Sophie said, looking up from her biology textbook. "I got paired with the new girl from Guatemala for our presentation on environmental science. Her English is still developing, so I'm going to help her practice before we present." "That's kind of you," David said, recognizing the echo of Anaya's childhood generosity in Sophie's instinct to help someone who was struggling. "And I got accepted to volunteer at the Children's Hospital this summer," Anaya announced. "I'll be reading to kids who are staying there for long-term treatment." Nicole beamed with pride. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. What made you want to do that specifically?" "I remember how scared I was when I had to stay in the hospital that time with pneumonia, and how much better I felt when the volunteers came to read stories. I want to be that for other kids." After the girls finished their homework and went to their rooms, David and Nicole sat together on their couch, sharing the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to appreciate quiet moments together. The house felt lived in and loved, filled with books and artwork, and the accumulated memories of a family that had chosen each other deliberately. "Do you ever miss it?" Nicole asked suddenly. "The corporate job, the bigger salary, the status that came with that life?" David considered her question seriously, running through mental images of his former existence, the pressure of quarterly reviews, the politics of office hierarchies, the way success had been measured by metrics that felt increasingly meaningless the further he got from that world. "I miss the financial security," he said honestly. "I miss being able to buy things without checking the bank balance first, being able to take vacations without saving for months, not worrying about unexpected expenses. But I don't miss the person I was becoming in that environment. I don't miss the way work stress affected my relationship with Sophie, or how I used to measure my worth by my job title. I don't miss the isolation that came from thinking success was something you achieved alone." He paused, looking around their modest living room with its mismatched furniture and walls covered with family photos and children's artwork. "This feels more real, more sustainable, more connected to what actually matters." Nicole nodded. "I think about that sometimes, too. About the path I didn't take to Chicago, about the salary I turned down, about the opportunities I might have missed by staying here. Any regrets?" "None. This is where I met you, where Anaya found her confidence, where we built something meaningful together. The other path might have offered more money, but it wouldn't have offered more happiness." That weekend, the family volunteered together at a community literacy fair that David had helped organize. Local schools, libraries, and educational organizations set up booths to promote reading and provide resources for families throughout the city. Sophie and Anaya helped younger children navigate the activities, while David and Nicole coordinated logistics and answered questions from parents. The event drew hundreds of families, representing the full diversity of their city's population. David watched children who'd been part of his tutoring programs over the years, many now reading confidently and helping others develop their own skills. Parents shared stories about how the literacy programs had impacted their families, how evening reading had become a cherished ritual, how children who'd once struggled academically were now thriving in school. But the moment that stayed with him happened near the end of the day, when a young mother approached him carrying a toddler and holding the hand of a kindergartner. "Mr. Hartley, I'm Maria Santos. My son Luis was in your tutoring program 3 years ago." David recognized the name immediately. Luis had been one of his first students, a boy whose dyslexia had made reading a source of frustration and shame until he'd learned strategies that worked with his learning style rather than against it. "Of course. How is Luis doing?" "He's thriving, reading above grade level now, considering the accelerated program for middle school. But I wanted to thank you for something else." She shifted the toddler to her other hip and continued. "Watching Luis succeed, seeing how you believed in him when other teachers had given up, it made me believe I could succeed too. I finished my GED last year and started nursing school this fall." David felt his eyes mist as he processed what she was saying. "Maria, that's incredible. Congratulations. None of it would have happened without what you did for Luis. You didn't just teach him to read better, you taught our whole family that we were capable of more than we'd imagined." After she walked away, David stood quietly in the bustling fairground, overwhelmed by the interconnectedness of it all. A little girl's $10 had saved his dignity. His tutoring had helped a boy overcome his learning challenges. The boy's success had inspired his mother to pursue her own education. The mother's achievement would likely influence her younger children's expectations for themselves. The ripples continued in directions he couldn't see or predict. That evening, as they cleaned up after the literacy fair, Nicole found David sitting in the empty school library where he'd first started volunteering. The space had been transformed over the years. New books, better lighting, comfortable seating areas, technology stations that provided access to digital resources. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling beside him on one of the reading chairs they'd helped select when the library was renovated. I was thinking about interconnection, about how one act of kindness can create changes that extend far beyond what anyone intended or imagined. Anaya's $10? That started it, but it's bigger than that now. Every child we've helped has gone on to influence other people, their siblings, their friends, eventually their own children. Every family that's discovered the joy of reading together is creating a legacy that will last for generations. Nicole nodded. It's like dropping a stone in a pond. You can see the initial splash, but the ripples go much further than you can track. Exactly. And I think that's what makes this work sustainable in a way that corporate success never was. When your impact is measured by how much you can help other people achieve their potential, there's no ceiling on what's possible. They sat together in the quiet library, surrounded by books that represented countless stories and endless possibilities for learning and growth. Through the windows, they could see the parking lot where volunteers were loading leftover materials into their cars, families walking to their vehicles with arms full of free books and resources, children still chattering excitedly about the day's activities. What do you think Sophie and Anaya will remember most about growing up in this environment? Nicole asked. I hope they'll remember that their parents chose meaningful work over lucrative work, that we prioritized community over individual achievement, that we showed them it's possible to build a life around service without sacrificing personal happiness. And if they choose different paths, if they decide they want the corporate careers and suburban lifestyles we walked away from? David considered this possibility seriously. Both girls were academically gifted and would have opportunities to pursue whatever futures they chose. Sophie had shown interest in environmental science and was already talking about college programs that would prepare her for research careers. Anaya was exploring both medicine and education, drawn to professions that would allow her to help others while engaging her intellectual curiosity. Then I'll support their choices completely, as long as they're making decisions based on their own values and aspirations rather than external pressure or fear. But you hope they'll choose service-oriented careers? I hope they'll choose careers that make them happy and allow them to contribute positively to the world, whether that's through education, medicine, environmental protection, social work, or something we haven't even imagined yet. As they prepared to leave the library, David noticed a new addition to the bulletin board near the entrance. Someone had posted a handwritten note that read, "Thank you to Mr. David and all the tutors who help kids love reading. My daughter went from hating books to reading every night before bed. You changed our family's story." The note was unsigned, but it joined dozens of others that had accumulated over the years: testimonials from parents, thank you cards from students, photos of graduation ceremonies and academic achievements, invitations to birthday parties and family celebrations. The bulletin board had become an informal memorial to the impact of their work, a visual reminder of why they'd chosen this path. Driving home through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, David reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. 3 years ago, he'd been a desperate man whose life was collapsing around him, who'd measured his worth by external validation and material success. The humiliation at Henderson's Market had felt like the end of everything he'd worked to build. But it had actually been the beginning of something better. A life built on authentic relationships, meaningful work, and the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from contributing to something larger than yourself. The financial security was modest, but sufficient. The work was challenging, but fulfilling. The family was chosen, rather than conventional, but filled with love and mutual support. Most importantly, he'd learned that failure could be transformative if you were willing to let it teach you what really mattered. That accepting help wasn't shameful, but human. That giving help was the most reliable path to happiness he'd ever discovered. At home, Sophie and Anaya were in the kitchen making popcorn and debating which movie to watch for their Saturday night family tradition. The scene was ordinary and precious. Two teenagers engaged in the kind of sibling negotiation that had become the soundtrack of their household, their voices carrying the comfortable antagonism of people who knew they were deeply loved and completely secure. "We watched your choice last week," Sophie was arguing. "It's my turn to pick." "But you always choose movies that are too sad," Anaya protested. "I don't want to cry tonight." "Fine, we'll compromise. Nothing too sad, nothing too silly. Something in the middle." David and Nicole exchanged amused glances as they listened to their daughters navigate the complex diplomacy of shared decision-making. These were the moments he'd missed during the months of supervised visitation, the ordinary interactions that created the texture of family life. "Any decisions yet?" Nicole called out as they joined the girls in the kitchen. "We're thinking maybe something about teachers or schools," Sophie said. "You know, to celebrate Dad's literacy fair success." "As long as it's not too cheesy," Anaya added pragmatically. "We want to feel good, not like we're watching a commercial for education." They settled on Dead Poets Society, a film that managed to be both inspiring and realistic about the challenges and rewards of teaching. As they watched Robin Williams encourage his students to think independently and pursue their passions, David found himself thinking about his own students and the ways education could transform lives when approached with creativity and genuine care. During the movie's most famous scene, Carpe Diem, Seize the Day, Sophie paused the film and turned to her parents. "Do you think you seized the day when you decided to change careers, Dad?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you could have kept looking for another corporate job, kept trying to go back to the life you had before. Instead, you took a risk on something completely different. That seems like seizing the day." David considered her observation seriously. At the time, his career change had felt less like a bold choice and more like the only option available to him. But from his current perspective, he could see that it had required a kind of courage, the willingness to build something new, rather than trying to recreate something that hadn't been working. "I think maybe the day seized me," he said finally. "Sometimes life pushes you in directions you wouldn't have chosen, and you have to decide whether to resist or find ways to make the new direction meaningful." "But you chose to make it meaningful," Anaya pointed out. "You could have just taken any job to pay the bills and been miserable about it. Instead, you turned it into something you love." Nicole smiled at her daughter's insight. "That's very wise, sweetheart." "I learn from good examples," Anaya said simply, settling back into the couch cushions as Sophie restarted the movie. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed and the house had settled into the comfortable quiet of a Saturday evening, David and Nicole sat together on their back porch, sharing a cup of tea and looking up at stars that were barely visible through the city's ambient light. "Do you think we're teaching them the right lessons?" David asked, continuing the conversation Sophie had started during the movie. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are we showing them that it's okay to take risks, to prioritize meaning over money, to choose unconventional paths? Or are we setting them up to struggle financially because they'll think passion is more important than practical considerations?" Nicole was quiet for a moment, considering his concern. "I think we're showing them that there are different ways to define success, and that the most important thing is making choices that align with your values. But what if their values lead them to choose careers that don't pay well? What if they become teachers or social workers or artists and struggle financially the way we did during the transition? Then they'll learn what we learned, that financial struggle is manageable when you're doing work that matters to you, and that happiness doesn't require luxury." David nodded, though he still felt conflicted about the messages they might be sending. He wanted his daughters to be idealistic and service-oriented, but he also wanted them to have financial security and practical skills for navigating an increasingly competitive economy. "I think the key is teaching them to be thoughtful about their choices," Nicole continued. "To consider both passion and practicality, to understand that meaningful work often requires sacrifice, but that sacrifice can be worthwhile when it leads to genuine fulfillment. And to know that they have our support, whatever they choose?" Absolutely. Whether they become doctors or teachers or engineers or artists or anything else, as long as they're making thoughtful decisions based on their own values and interests. As they prepared for bed, David took a final look at his home office, where Anaya's $10 bill still held place of honor on his desk. The bill was faded now, its edges worn soft from years of handling, but it remained a powerful reminder of the moment when everything changed. Tomorrow would bring another week of coordinating literacy programs, writing grant applications, training volunteer tutors, and measuring progress through the kind of metrics that actually mattered. Children's improved confidence, families' increased engagement with reading, communities' enhanced support for education. It wasn't the life he'd planned when he was climbing corporate ladders and accumulating possessions and measuring success by external recognition. But it was a life that fit him in ways that his previous existence never had. Work that utilized his skills while serving others. A partnership that challenged and supported him equally. Children who were thriving in an environment of love and high expectations. Most importantly, it was a life built on the understanding that the best stories aren't about individual triumph over adversity, but about communities of people supporting each other through difficulties and celebrating each other's successes. The grocery store humiliation that had felt like an ending had actually been a beginning. The first chapter of a story about how accepting help with grace can lead to offering help with generosity. How personal crisis can become community healing. How the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples of transformation that extend far beyond what anyone can see or imagine. Because sometimes the end of one chapter really is the beginning of a much better story. Sometimes losing everything you thought mattered teaches you what actually matters. And sometimes a child's simple act of generosity, 10 crumpled dollars offered without judgment or expectation, can reshape not just a moment of crisis, but an entire life's trajectory. David Hartley had learned that true success isn't about never needing help. It's about accepting help gracefully when it's offered, extending help generously when you can, and building something meaningful from whatever circumstances you're given. The little black girl who had offered him $10 at Henderson's Market had given him something infinitely more valuable, a chance to discover who he really was when everything else was stripped away, and who he could become when he chose service over self-interest. In that discovery, he'd found not just love and purpose and financial stability, but something even more precious, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. A community built on the simple but revolutionary idea that we're all responsible for each other's well-being, and that the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples of transformation that extend far beyond what we can see or imagine. And in the quiet moments before sleep, surrounded by the gentle sounds of his chosen family, Nicole's steady breathing, the soft rustle of pages as one of the girls read under her covers, the distant hum of traffic carrying other people home to their own versions of happiness, David felt the deep satisfaction that comes from building a life that matters, not because of its external markers of success, but because of the love and service and authentic connection that filled every ordinary day.